So thanks for coming tonight and today and yesterday as well, if you were up at Columbia. I'm Aoibheann Sweeney. I'm the director of the Center for Humanities. We're one of the academic centers that's sponsoring this and organizing this conference, along with the concentration in 20th Century Studies, the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and finally the Holocaust Educators Network and the Memorial Library and Art Collection for World War II here at CUNY that have sponsored this event. This conference, as those of you who have been in attendance for the past day and a half are aware, is also sponsored partly by Columbia, in particular the newly inaugurated Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference up at Columbia, and the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia Law School, other sponsors at Columbia as well. Before I go any further, I just wanted to thank Micah Washburn, who's been running around a lot today. He's done a great job with all the AV stuff, as well as Stefania Heim, who's been well thanked, and Amia Melnick, and then finally Suvi Lettinen, who's having our final day with us today, and we're very sad to see her go. So just a little shout out to Suvi. In general, this is, the usual drone at the beginning of an introduction, but it's also signifies a crosstown collaboration, which has been, for me anyway, totally enjoyable and exciting and extremely fruitful, really the hallmark of the conference. And the inspiration came from Nancy Miller and Marianne Hirsch, whom you've both heard from. They're currently teaching a literature class at the Graduate Center. Did I just turn off my microphone? No? And their scholarship and friendship and kind of unfathomable energy have made the bridging of the gap between our campuses really seem almost effortless, and something that I hope we can do more of. Each of them, as those of you who have attended the conference know, came to the idea for the conference on their own through their own personal journeys to retrieve and understand their own lost legacies and shared Jewish heritage. But by the time they came to me with the idea of doing a conference, they had already, with characteristic, I think, integrity and studiousness, begun to scrutinize the political and aesthetic stakes of these journeys, and to take into account who gets to return and who doesn't, to consider new diasporas, new traumas, new forms of neglect and appropriation, and the effects of new technologies on these broad issues. So the resulting conference has been really remarkable. It began yesterday afternoon up at Columbia with a panel that brought scholars together with artists and museum professionals to explore sites of trauma, from a former ghetto in Poland to a torture and detention center in Chile, and their potential and even obligation, some people would argue, to redress history and contemporary politics. This was followed by an evening panel with photographers and scholars on the aftermath of Katrina in New Orleans, a much fresher trauma, and one that clearly has yet to be redressed. This morning we began with a panel exploring collective and private sort of mythologies of return through the variously frustrating and irresistible forms of media, photography, internet, voice recordings. And we moved on into a fascinating discussion of genetic anthropology and genealogy testing. Each of these panels, culminating in Nancy Miller's three-way conversation with Mendelsohn, Hoffman, and Hartman, which I think many of you just witnessed, was its own kind of return to the questions raised at the beginning of the conference. It is, as all of you are aware, I'm sure, an intellectual privilege to keep returning to the same questions over and over again. But if there was one thing that I think all of our participants would agree upon, it is that it is also a human right. What all of our speakers have expressed, whether they are dissembling mythologies generated by nostalgia or guiding historical interventions, is that the act of re-examining and remembering is not only a deeply human need, but a social and political obligation. I think one of the most powerful moments in our two panels yesterday was when the photographer Susan Meiselas showed a film of 20 different photographs she took in Nicaragua back in the 70s, war-torn Nicaragua. And she enlarged these and hung them in the locations where they were taken. And they were of sort of soldiers behind sandbags and women fleeing and houses and streetscapes in wartime. She made a film of these photographs being hung, and this is a film of people in Nicaragua today, 25 years later, passing the same spot and looking at the photographs. Afterwards, when she was talking, she told us that her partner in the project had collected the reactions of passersby who recognized themselves in the photographs, or in some cases their children or other people's children, which is obviously would have been an incredibly moving situation. But Myzalis herself actually resisted this narrative device, and I thought that was a really interesting move. Instead, she gave us these kind of long shots of people simply sort of studying the pictures, often in silence, and confronting nothing that we could see that they truly recognized, but as one observer in the film actually said, what I have fixed in my mind from that time. All of our participants today have found ways to open and challenge romantic notions of return, and also to acknowledge its mythological, biological, and cultural draw. All of them have also attempted to define the ways in which both intellectual and physical return is thwarted by disengagement, by suppression, by forced exile and dispersal, by war and trauma and perpetually unjust legislation. All of them have called for the need for action, political, creative, and intellectual. But it takes a thinker with deep intellectual integrity as well as emotional honesty to put all this together. And I can't think of a better candidate than our keynote speaker, Amira Haas. I am extremely honored to be introducing her tonight and delighted that she has been able to witness our conversation for these past 2 days. Since 1993, Amira Haas has been living in Palestinian communities of Gaza Strip and the West Bank, working as a reporter for the Israeli paper Haaretz. 2 of her books have been translated into English and are being sold out there. Drinking the Sea at Gaza, Days and Nights in a Land Under Siege, and Reporting from Ramallah, an Israeli journalist in an occupied land. Go to Gaza in the local Israeli idiom is another way to say go to hell. But in Drinking the Sea at Gaza, Haas, who was born in Jerusalem, describes it as a kind of return. Like many of the returns we've explored in the past 2 days, her return begins with a memory, not her own, but of her mother's. It is a summer day in 1944 when her mother was herded from a cattle car along with the rest of the human cargo, which had been transported from Belgrade to the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen, and she saw a group of German women, some on foot and some on bicycles, slow down and watch the procession go by. In the end, Haas writes, my desire to live in Gaza stemmed neither from adventurism nor from insanity, but from that dread of being a bystander, from my need to understand, down to the last detail, a world that is, to the best of my political and historical comprehension, a profoundly Israeli creation. I quickly found that something tied me to the refugees and the camps in which they lived. I felt at home there, in the temporary permanence, in the longing that clings to every grain of sand, in the rage that thrives in the alleyways. Only gradually, and just to a very few friends in Gaza and Israel, did I begin to explain that it was my heritage, a singular autobiographical blend passed on by my parents that had paved my way to the Gaza Strip. In this one small passage, Haas has, I think, summarized much of the complexities we have been circling around in our panel discussions, the autobiographical blend in all of us that we can do nothing better, I think, than to challenge. So we are blessed to have her here, and without further ado, please welcome Amira Haas.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for coming, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's always refreshing to be able to tell the truth. I'm not a postmodernist. There is a truth of occupation and oppression that I tell, but it's refreshing, if I could use this word, to do it, not always in the normative journalistic way. Today, April 11th of April, today is exactly 21 years ago, 21 years after the Italian Jewish writer Primo Levi committed suicide. He jumped from the third floor landing at his home in Turin, Italy. As we all know, Levi had survived Auschwitz, where he was interned in February 26th of February 1943. And then he was freed 2 years later, January 27th, 1945. He was obliged to remain in the Soviet zone until October 45, and only then did he return to Italy, to Turin. A very concrete and natural return to his country, to his hometown, landscapes, language, home and family. Primo Levi was one of 8,500 Italian Jews out of 45,000 who lived in Italy, who were sent as cargo to death camps. 7,900 never returned. For more than 30 years, until he committed suicide, Levi opted for the concrete physical return, which was an active plaidoyer for the diaspora, without a center. A diaspora for the right of Jews to remain scattered in the diaspora. A historio-philosophical statement that the natural place for a Jew was his or her place of birth, anywhere in the world, and not a legendary homeland. This statement was addressed both to Zionists and to anti-Semites. His was a return to the concept of citizenship, which is non-ethnic, non-religious, exactly the opposite of Israeli citizenship. Consciously, I have no way to know. In his self-murder, as the German term would be, Levi undid two returns. The concrete return that he had chosen in 1945, and the other one that he did not consider, the mythological return to the land of Israel. Was it, when he committed suicide, was it that he discovered that not only poetry did not exist after Auschwitz? Did he want to tell us that no return was possible after Auschwitz? We cannot tell. But in 1950, he, like all the Jews over the world, was endowed with the legal right to immigrate to 2-year-old Israel. In July 1950, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed the law of return, which endowed every Jew with the right to return to a place he/she never knew, or knew only from the Bible or from stories. This was an expected and understandable move, I would say, 5 years after the German European industry of murder was finally shut down, while its product, destruction, was destined to have long shelf life. Every Jew has the right to come to this country, reads the law. After 1948, 3,000 Italian Jews made use of this right to return to an unknown place. The relatively very small number of Italian Jews, less than a tenth of the Jewish community, may suggest several realities. That the estrangement of Italian Jews from their place of birth, estrangement because of the German European death industry, was not as strong and widespread as in Poland, for example. That there was not much time left for Nazi diktats after the Italian capitulation to totally ruin the Italian community and its roots in the Italian society. And also that the attraction of a new state in dear physical and economical conditions was obviously weaker than the attraction of that of an optimistic, apparently stable, new Italian republic. Especially that this republic did not fall within the Soviet zone of influence like Romania did. This was another ex-fascist regime where a great part of the Jewish community, like in Italy, was spared the fate of its sister community in Nazi German-occupied Poland. But there in Romania, most of the Jews chose to emigrate en masse. Since early on, so history tells us, the movement of return to the alleged ancestral land of the Jews navigated between several competing drives. The personal religious drive, then the religious-based but secular and nationalist drive, inspired by the romantic ethnic nationalism of Germany and Central Europe, that is Zionism, And then the drive to escape persecution and discrimination, harsh economic conditions, dictatorships, especially when traditional havens of immigration, such as America or England, shut their gates. At times, two or all three drives work together. But the fact remains that only with the rise and success of genocidal anti-Semitism did Zionism stop attracting only the minority of Jews. Only then did it start becoming the ideological home of a greater part of the already decimated community. Ideological home does not mean, of course, making use of that right of return, as you know very well here in America, with a great big Jewish Zionist lobby. Back to the law of return. Upon choosing Israel, every Jew was not defined as a returnee, neither as an emigrant, but as a ole, and in plural, olim. Ole stems from the Hebrew verb to mount, to ascend, as the land of Israel, so the Talmud has taught us, is higher than all lands. That is why leaving Israel is descending, yerida. In Zionist jargon, descending is a disparaging term, full of spite and scorn, the opposite of the highly valued ascending, aliyah. But when it was first used in the Bible, it had no judgmental connotation. Ascending in the past did not mean necessarily immigration to the land of Israel. A visit was enough to be termed as aliyah. Only in the Zionist jargon has aliyah become a synonym for immigration with the added value to the word. And the law continues. Every Jew who has immigrated into this country before the coming into force of this law, and every Jew who was born in this country, whether before or after the coming into force of this law, shall be deemed to be a person who has come to this country as an ole under this law. Grammatically, ole does not designate someone who has completed an action, but rather one who is still in the process of the act. That is, the very birth of a Jew in the country makes him, her, an ole. So it endows him, her, with a spiritual state of permanent ascendancy that never ends. I was born in Jerusalem, and therefore till the last of my days will be an olah, will keep ascending in this meta-spatial meaning of the term. Every Jew in this room has this right to share the meta-spatial experience of Aliyah. The legislator reserved the return to the collective act, a people returning to its ancestral homeland, as the Charter of Independence claims. They did not term everybody as a returnee. Whether they shied at defining every person who never even saw the country before as a returnee, that is, whether they simply could not go as far as to conjuring up linguistic and legalistic meta-real situations, I cannot tell. Maybe they just wanted to make use of the very biblical ancient term which is in their arsenal, in order to attest to a concrete continuity, not at all imagined, as they want to picture it, between the land and the people. Faisal Hourani is a returnee. He is a friend of mine, so is his daughter, who lives in Ramallah now. He is a Palestinian writer born in 1939 in the Palestinian village of Masmiya, on the road between Jerusalem to Gaza, nearer to the coast. In 1948, the villagers had to flee because of the battles and the attacks of the Hebrew troops, and since then were not allowed to return back. His mother settled in Gaza as a refugee. He, a 9-year-old boy, was later sent to his dead father's parents, who had fled to Damascus and lived there in exile. In 1996, he returned to the country, not to his home village, whose houses were razed and whose lands were divided between several Israeli Jewish communities. He returned to Ramallah. It is only because the Israeli authorities authorized his return that he could re-enter his homeland, or rather, that piece of the homeland that was occupied in 1967. He could re-enter for the first time after 48 years. For 48 years, he could not even visit. Without such permit, no Palestinian can return to the country. They cannot even return for a short visit if Israeli authorities do not permit. Faisal Hourani received an identity card of the Palestinian Authority, but this too could be granted only because the Israelis authorized it. Till this very day, no Palestinian personal status is valid and recognized from birth to death and change of address unless it is registered in the computerized data of the Israeli Ministry of Interior. The Palestinian, not the Israeli, jargon names Hourani as a returnee, as are all other several thousands of PLO top employees which Israel allowed to re-enter the country. Because Hourani was born in the country, his return was concrete, and the Palestinian term has no shred of manipulative symbolism. If there was anything meta-real about this return, it was the fact that he could not return to his home, raised long ago, as I said. He could not return to the landscapes of his childhood. Also, the mother of his children, they are divorced by now, but the mother of his 3 daughters, who was born in Safed, she cannot return. She is not allowed to return, not even for a visit, because Israel does not allow. In his newly issued identity card, printed by a Palestinian printer, yet authorized to its last detail by Israel, what is written as the place of birth is Israel. But Israel did not exist when he was born. Moreover, an Israeli citizen, Jew or Palestinian, who was born in the country before the establishment of the state, that is before 48, his place or her place of birth would be specified: Jerusalem, Haifa, Tel Aviv. But Zionist bureaucracy cannot acknowledge that a Palestinian refugee who now resides in the 67 occupied territories has had roots in concrete places within what is today Israel proper. Wouldn't be a tacit recognition of his right to return? Therefore, it's written only Israel. Therefore, Palestinians whom Israel allows to return are obliged to participate in the meta-temporal transformation of the country into the Jewish state years before it was the state of Israel. In their concrete real return to their homeland, they must pay the added value tax, acknowledge the eternal status of this state, which goes beyond the boundaries of history, a state which expelled 800,000 of them, of some 500 communities, and ever since tries to downplay their belonging to it. And there is another curiosity here. The Israel as birth of place in Palestinian IDs is the only word which is not printed both in Hebrew and Arabic, only in Hebrew. That means place of birth written only in Hebrew, Israel. Is it that the Arabic letters could not bear the myth and the lie? I don't know. Zionist ideology does its best to concretize the alleged blood links that Jews all over the world have with each other and to connect them all to the soil of the Holy Land. But the very terminology used by Israeli bureaucracy, as we see in the law or in the identity card of Faisal Hourani, but this all very terminology which is used in order to connect the blood with the soil or to separate the blood from the soil, extradites the mythological, poetically metaphysical connection. What the law of return does not dare to do, that is to combine return with subject, with personal pronouns, is done by a huge road sign, a board, placed at a junction 3 kilometers to the east of the Palestinian town of Ramallah. The junction is controlled now by an illegal, unauthorized outpost, an offshoot of a nearby colony, Bet El, not less illegal. We returned home, the board shouts. Here in Bet El, 3,800 years ago, the land of Israel was promised to the people of Israel by the Creator of the world. By force of this promise, we see today in Haifa, Tel Aviv, Shiloh, another settlement, and Hebron. The board is signed by the colony's local council, the local council of Bet El. At the bottom of this spiritualistic text, there is a very concrete reference to the commercial sponsors, 2 supermarkets in Bet El and the company which prints and installs the boards. Then the road splits into 3 side roads. one to the colony and the biggest Israeli military base in the West Bank. This road is open for Jews only, or for soldiers and suppliers and workers who might be not Jewish but are Israeli citizens. But all of the inhabitants of the colony are Jewish, of course. One road of the three, which leads to some villages, is blocked since 8 years already, or 7 years already. No movement is allowed. And the third road leads to Ramallah, but is blocked by a manned checkpoint, where soldiers allow passage only of notables, Palestinian notables, PA, Palestinian Authority officials, diplomats, foreign diplomats, NGO employees, journalists like myself. Otherwise, mortals are prohibited from passing through. 2.5 kilometers away from the road sign, which claims we returned home after 3,800 years, these two blocked roads make the daily return home, from work, a real nuisance for Palestinians. 20 to 30 minutes long instead of 5 minutes or 8 minutes. It is in 1977 the Jews returned to Beit El, where Abraham built an altar 3,800 years ago. Maybe it's already 3,800 years ago. Maybe it's already 3,802 years ago, because the sign was old. Among other places to which Jews returned to since 1967 is a colony called Halamish, some 20 kilometers west of Ramallah. It was also built in 1977. The Palestinians who live in Nabi Salah, a village on whose lands the colony was built, tell about an American journalist who interviewed one of the village's old men. It was probably in the beginning of the 80s. "Since when are you here?" the journalist is said to have asked the old man. And then the old man asked the journalist to look around. "Do you see the valley below?" he asked him. "From here, up here, I used to watch Adam and Eve playing together." Obviously, the question echoed the Zionist argumentation that Palestinians were new to the country, not like Jews who were here 3,802 years ago. Another returnee, a Palestinian Marxist, whose first name is Daoud, did not have to go so far as Adam and Eve's days in order to claim his roots. Of all Arab peoples, he told me once, Hebrew biblical names are the most widespread among Palestinians: Daoud, Musa, Sarah, Maryam, Isaac, etc. Names are passed from grandfather to grandson, grandmother to granddaughter, through generations. His materialistic conclusion was, many of the Palestinians are descendants of the ancient Hebrews. Early attempts by the Palestinian Ministry of Culture to connect Palestinians with the Canaanite past and ancestors do not seem to have taken root. It is suffice for most people to point at a house that was theirs or their families, and is now occupied by an Orthodox Jewish kindergarten, or by a Peace Now, or it is the home of a Peace Now activist. Trees that grandparents had planted and cacti that delineated their family's land from the land of the neighbors are as good as written deeds of ownership. In 1967, 19 years after their expulsion, old people could go back for the first time to see their homes in their destroyed villages. Many, I was told by friends in Gaza, returned to the refugee camps and died of a heart attack, or rather, died of a broken heart. Upon their return as visitors, they realized that a concrete permanent return was an impossibility, or at least much more distant than they had imagined when they could not visit. I also had a grandfather, actually a great-grandfather, who died in the country, in Jerusalem, not of a broken heart, but of very old age. Actually, he chose to emigrate from Sarajevo, Bosnia, in order to die in the Holy Land, sometime in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Already then, so the family legend goes, was he in his 90s. He mistakenly assumed he'd die immediately upon his arrival. I doubt he ever termed it as a return. My family's lost genealogical tree reaching the 1492 expulsion from Spain, and not Eve's times, not even Sarah's days. And Sarajevo was their perfect home for generations. My mother used to joke that his death and his burial place in the Mount of Olives cemetery guaranteed our right to stay in the country, according to the original PLO charter of July 68. This charter says, the Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be considered Palestinians. A common interpretation to this sentence is that Zionist invasion started with Balfour's declaration about a Jewish home in Palestine in 1917. Like Primo, my mother was a Levi. Like him, she survived the concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen. Like Primo Levi, at first, she opted for her right to return home, Yugoslavia. As a Jew, so the joke says, she was a real Yugoslav, not Bosnian, not Serb, not Croat. She did not return to Israel in 1948, but she fled to Israel. Fled from the terrible void she had found in her real home country. I believe it was the same void that made Primo Levi do eventually what the Nazis did not succeed in doing, murder himself. Some 40 years later, my mother tried to undo this flight and return to Yugoslavia. It was still once Yugoslavia. She was already 70 years old. She almost rented a room in a Belgrade flat when the owner told her, through this window I could see the Jews being rounded up and sent away. My mother took her unpacked suitcase and fled again, back to Paris, her chosen diaspora for some 10 years already. In doing so, she voted for the right of Jews to live in the diaspora of their liking, not necessarily the diaspora in which they were born. Hers then was a temporary return to the diaspora and to the impractical principle of people's right to live wherever they choose. She did return to Israel in the early 90s, this time not a mythological return based on a law, but a concrete return to a physical home. Twice was I asked whether I have ever thought of returning to Sarajevo, meaning returning to live there. I immediately saw beyond the words, and the shock at being asked such a question prevented me from relating or addressing the two speakers to the absurd terminology. How could I return to a place I never lived in and visited only twice as a tourist? The one to ask me this question was a Palestinian prisoner with whom I used to converse via a clandestine cellular phone that the prisoners smuggled into prison. You should know that Palestinian political prisoners in Israel, unlike criminal prisoners and Jewish nationalist prisoners who murdered Palestinians, are not allowed to use payphones to speak with their families, even though their constitutional right, so to speak, of having familiar visits is being violated very often. So they don't see the family and they don't have the right to speak with them. The question would not have upset me so, this question if I ever thought of returning to Sarajevo, if the same person had not remarked just a few conversations before how a certain article of mine taught him new things, that not only Germany but other European societies had a share in the Judeocide, and that the survivors, when they returned home, often were not welcomed by the general society, by the societies. I thought that I finally met a Palestinian who grasped the refugee-ness of Jews, including Israeli citizens. But his question made me realize how deeply ingrained is the conception that even we, Israel-born Jews, do not really belong. I'm often asked by Palestinians, where are you from? I know very well what they mean, but I reply, I'm from Jerusalem, I was born there. No, they insist. Where did you really come from? They insist on giving me imagined routes into places and languages and landscapes which are totally foreign to me. Well, not totally, but are foreign to me, are not mine, are Fata Morgana, are a phantom. One woman, a returnee but originally from a refugee family, admitted that before she had met me, she told people, if Amira is such a progressive and against the occupation, she should return to where she came from. This should not give you the impression that all Palestinians think that way and feel that way, and I'll give you another story that my might show the complexity here or the variations. It was one day of the beginning of this intifada that I was walking in a demonstration with Marwan Barghouti, a Fatah leader and now in prison, and with another top Palestinian official, a counselor of Rafat, who came from Tunis. And he said some nonsense, this guy who came from Tunis, and Marwan told me, don't listen, in Hebrew. He told me, don't listen to him, he's a liar. The guy, very, as I said, very high top in the hierarchy of Arafat, was upset that we were speaking in a language he doesn't understand, and he remarked something, and Marwan continues, oh, those who returned, or those who came, I don't remember what he used, those who returned from Tunis, they don't know Hebrew, they are goyim. So by having this sort of humor, you can say that many Palestinians, and also this is an impression of mine, like the former one, do see our presence as a natural phenomenon already in the country. True, I was upset by the question of the Palestinian prisoner, but a similar question by a French woman really enraged me. She came in one of those solidarity tours at the beginning of the current Palestinian uprising. She had read my articles, my book, she was full of admiration and compliments, etc. But then she asked me whether I thought of returning to Sarajevo. Whereto I asked, unbelieving my ears. Then I realized there was nothing wrong with the ears, and I shouted, return to a continent which threw us out of the globe, out of the living. I smelled an anti-Semite who says, you have no right to be where you are. I smelled a European, a Christian, that ignores the very known history which made me be where I am. It's her history. True, I'm not an Allah, in the sense that the law of return imposes on me. I do not feel this elation for being on a permanent ascendance due to my being an Israeli Jewish citizen. In a way, or practically, actually, I wish my parents emigrated elsewhere, but they did not, and Israel became my diaspora. I tried another diaspora for 2 years and hurried back to the sun and light and vegetation and language and all the other things which make a home a home. Also, my father fled the void he had encountered in his Romanian hometown after he returned from 4 years in a Transnistria ghetto. Like my mother, he never was a Zionist, and yet he found himself in Israel at the end of 48. Ole, who, like my mother, became more and more acquainted and pained with the Palestinian plight and void. Sometimes at the beginning of the first Intifada, maybe 1988, maybe 89, he shared with me a dream he had the previous night. He so vividly described it that sometimes I feel I was dreaming it with him. In that dream, he and I, were standing on a hill facing the east. Thousands of people were walking towards us, going down the hills and up the mountains and through the valleys. My father held my hand, his happiness overwhelmed him, and he exclaimed, "Look, Amira, look, they are coming back, they are coming back." The return he dreamed about was, of course, the return of the Palestinians. The dream told me more than all of our past and future conversations how tormented he has been all these years with the implications of his mythological return to the Holy Land, or rather the implications of his concrete flight from what used to be his home, namely the dispossession of an entire people from its homeland. So he dreamed the solution, undoing history. For years, Palestinians, many of them, believed it was possible to undo history and return home, to their practical home, to their concrete homes. On the declarative level, all Palestinian organizations still demand, till today, that the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their homes be included in any future peace settlement. I suspect that for many, telling openly about their suspicions that the concrete return was impossible, at least in our lifetime, would be considered a total breach of all commonly accepted rules, maybe even treason, certainly politically incorrect. Back in 1994, my friends in Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip started expanding their former shack and replacing it by a solid, large, 3-story building made of blocks of concrete. for the entire family. How come you started building it only now, I asked them. I asked the father of the family, a refugee of a village called Brer, where a kibbutz called Bror Chayil is now built. He surprised me when he replied that now, with the Oslo Accords, he knew for sure that they would never return home. But there are other villagers who know they would not return home, and they were expelled in 67, not in 48, from 3 villages to the west of Jerusalem. The 3 villages are Amwas, Yalo, and Bet Nuba. The 3 villages are located in an area which the Hebrew army failed to conquer in 48. Soldiers who occupied the villages in 67 at the end of the war ordered all inhabitants to leave for Ramallah. Then they detonated the solid stone houses or used bulldozers in order to topple them down. Some people were said to have been killed in their houses, others on the road while fleeing. In 1973, the Jewish National Fund in Canada collected money to turn 2 of these destroyed villages, Amwas and Yalu, into a park called Canada Park. It is a popular recreation site for Israelis who return to enjoy it every year or every holiday. For some of the villagers, it was already the 2nd expulsion. They moved to those 3 villages after they fled or were driven out from their original villages in 1948. In 1986, they wrote a letter, the villagers, a request to return to our villages. They wrote it to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the President of the Knesset. 17th of March, 1986. Your Excellencies, as inhabitants of Amwas, Yalu, and Bet Nuba, we have the honor to appeal to your Excellencies in the hope that you will examine our legitimate request. We ask only for our legitimate humanitarian right to return to the villages from which we were driven and expelled. Before the war in 67, we lived peacefully in our villages on the West Bank Israeli border, with no problems with our Israeli neighbors. We were in no way a threat to security or a destabilizing presence in the area. For no reason, from the very beginning of the war, we were driven out of our villages, on foot, with our children and elderly. The Israeli army ordered us to leave our houses, telling us we could return after the war. Since that day, we have been unable to go back to our homes, but we live in the hope that one day it will be possible. We have appealed to the West Bank military administration, but have had no reply to date. We are therefore referring our request to your Excellencies as supreme authorities of the State of Israel. Our houses were completely demolished and there is nothing left of our village. We were forced to leave our land and houses, and all was destroyed along with our furniture, our livestock, and all our possessions. But we still hope to be able to return. We are prepared to rebuild our houses ourselves without applying for compensation from the state, and we are full of hope that we shall be able to live once again, as in the past, as peaceful neighbors. Yours respectfully, the residents of Amwas, Yalu, and Bet Nuba. This was March 86. They never received a reply. An Israeli organization called Zochrot, Remembering, which took as a mission to remind Israelis of all those Palestinian sites which turned into Israeli sites today, and to remind them of the Nakba, of Palestinian catastrophe, wrote a letter to the Ministry of Defense sometime in November 2007, asking why the people could not return. They are Jews, so they received an answer. The answer arrived on March 2008, 22 years after the letter was written, the first letter. And it's a the counselor of the Minister of Defense confirms that he received the letter, and then he says, the return of the villagers is not allowed for security reasons. Now, not only they cannot return to the pre-48 homes, not only can they not return to the pre-67 homes, they're not even allowed to return now for a visit, to see the land. Most of those 67 refugees live in Ramallah area, some in nearby villages. Since 7 years, Israel had blocked the roads which lead to the 3 villages and their lands. Israelis are sure that this area is Israel proper. No way to think otherwise. There is no sign which says something else. The fate of these three villages indicates to Israel's overall policy, a sequence of dispossessions all over these years. If I spoke of an ascendancy, which is a para or meta special ascendancy of us, citizens of Israel, Jewish citizens of Israel, the real linking sequence is that of dispossession of Palestinians, beginning at 48, continuing till today. And every Jew here in this room has a right to return, and his or her return to Israel grants him privileges and more rights that any Palestinian who was born there has. The mythological return has successfully turned the concrete return of the Palestinians into an impossibility. It needs and still needs a lot of state violence for this. With the years, with the aging and dying of many of the first generation of refugees, the return home is becoming more and more trans-temporal, as I will show you in a poem by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. Maybe the trans-temporality will enable it to materialize one day. There is a poem, or two poems, that are relevant to this talk and this conference that I want to finish with. One is called "We Travel Like All People." We travel like everyone else, but we return to nothing, as if travel were a path of clouds. We buried our loved ones in the shade of clouds and between roots of trees. We said to our wives, "Give birth for hundreds of years, so that we may end this journey within an hour of a country, within a meter of the impossible." We travel in the chariots of the Psalms, sleep in the tents of the prophets, and are born again in the language of gypsies. We measure space with the hoopoe's beak, and sing so the distance may forget us. We cleanse the moonlight. Your road is so long, so dream of seven women to bear this long journey on your shoulders. Shake the trunks of palm trees for them. You know the names, and which one will give birth to the son of Galilee. Ours is a country of words. Talk, talk. Let me rest my road against a stone. Ours is a country of words. Talk, talk. Let me see an end to this journey. And some verses of another poem called "Who Am I Without Exile?" Nothing brings me back from this distance to the oasis, neither war nor peace. Nothing carries me or loads me with an idea, neither nostalgia nor promise. What shall I do? What shall I do without exile and a long night of gazing at the water? We have both been freed from the gravity of the land of identity. What shall we do? What shall we do without exile and long nights of gazing at the water? Thank you.
First, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming. You've always kind of been an inspiration for me, so it's very exciting to talk to you. I guess my question has to do with identity and how you are able to reconcile, on the one hand, an identification with the land and with the people, with also a condemnation of the existence of Israel as an apartheid state, or as a state of a kind of racist, violent practices. So how does that, I guess, how do you negotiate that in terms of your own self-identification?
I think that we are all made of several identities, not only one. And contradictions is a normal thing. Self-contradictions and schizophrenia is a normal thing, I believe. And yes, I was born as I said, I see it as my diaspora because it's only by chance that I was born there. But like Jewish Americans who are involved, who have been involved in struggles for justice and against the policy of their state, of their government, or like French Jews in the past. So I guess that an important component of my identity as a Jew is this of not identifying myself only along national or mainly along national and ethnic lines, but other lines, but other criteria. Yes, but I understand they want you to be near the mic.
Recently was two programs, one showing of the film in Counterpoint about the meeting of the family of the bereaved, the whole organization of families from Palestine and Israel who've lost loved ones, to the war on either side. And also, there were two men, one who is the editor of the Jerusalem Post, I think, who's an Israeli, and who's a Palestinian, and there's a Jewish man who's part of this reconciliation, talking about the two-state solution. Do you think there's any viability in the two-state solution?
Viability or feasibility for it to happen?
Right, or both.
Both. The question usually refers to the effect of the existing settlements and the belief that now it's too late to dismantle them. With this, I don't agree. I think technically it is possible. It is politically impossible now, but if there were pressure on Israel to dismantle all the settlements, true, it's difficult. There are 500,000 Israelis who live in settlements, and it's so 500,000 Israelis should stop breaking international law and humanitarian law and move 20 kilometers or 10 kilometers away. They don't go to another country, they don't go to another state, they just move a flat, go to another flat. So technically, I think it is possible. Now the question is why politically it is impossible, or has been impossible till today, or has been impossible to stop Israel from expanding settlements and bringing more settlers to live there. This is a different question. Now, if we achieve the two states, I believe that Palestinians as a whole, even though there is a lot of talk now about the only possible solution is one state, from my experience, most of the Palestinians just do not want to live with Jews in one state. They really are tired of us, and rightly so. And also Israelis. It's absurd to think that Israelis who do not agree now, Israeli Jews who do not agree now to have the two-state solution, will agree to jump to the other one, which is one state, and live in democracy, not with Jewish hegemony, in one state. In short, what I want to say, both options seem very unlikely now, because there is no political pressure and no political will, and because the occupation right now with the settlements pays off for Israelis. Most of the Israelis have direct invested and indirect invested interest in this occupation. They profit of it. We all profit. We profit from the Israeli control over the water resources. We profit from the upgrade the settlements offer us in conditions of living. We profit from the vast land that has been expropriated and turned into roads for Jews only, and which solve the problems of traffic jams from Jerusalem and other parts of the country. So this occupation brings about many professionals to develop their expertise, especially security expertise, and only thanks to this occupation. One of Israel's main or most important, not only in financial terms, but also in prestige and place in the world and acceptability in the world, is the security economy, which can develop only because we exercise and we we exercise it live on the ground. And I don't see a possibility. I don't see that in the near future the West will stop needing our security expertise.
I have two questions, and one of them is going to be, I suppose, somewhat provocative. The realities which you describe and the policies of the Israeli government are outraging and outrageous, and I was, of course, very stirred by what you said, and clearly, you know, there is a terrible level of injustice going on. I find one element missing from your analysis, and that is that the occupation started from a situation of conflict, and conflict in which actually Israel was attacked, you know, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And it has been perpetuated partly as a situation of conflict. And in a sense, I want to ask you, I mean, Palestinians also have policies. They also have policies, they also make political decisions, they also have agendas. We know what Israel needs to do. What would you advise the Palestinians to do if they wanted to change the situation? So, because I do think that in these analyses, too often the Palestinians are represented as a people without agency, and I don't see that that is right. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is really about the situation of Arabs within Israel, who do have citizenship and who constitute, I understand, almost 20% of the population now. So we don't have, I suppose, a purely ethnically based citizenship anymore.
We don't have
a purely ethnically based.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just to clarify.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have. That's right. That's why the slogan of 2 states for 2 peoples is a wrong slogan, because even if there are 2 states, the state of Israel is not a pure Jewish state, and but it is a democracy for Jews, and it is not a democracy for Arabs, for Palestinians. But ethnically, of course, it comprises of two ethnic groups, and it doesn't matter. I think most people should read the talk about demography as a criteria. Now to the first question, it's not. It's very much in place. Of course, Palestinians have agency, but they don't use it. And this is, and I often write about it, and that's why I'm not likened by the Palestinian officials just as much as I'm not liked by the Israelis. They don't use their agency. On the contrary, they have different, I wouldn't call it strategies, but they have different conflicting, or they are engaged, the Palestinians are engaged much more with competition with themselves over popularity in the street than they are engaged in the fight against the common enemy. And the choice of so-called armed struggle, or what I call the competition over whose is bigger, during the last 7 years really was disastrous. And then they have 2 political leaderships, one of Hamas and one of Fatah, and they compete with each other. And they compete with each other about salaries and about rule and about who will censor better the other side's papers, etc. And you have a Palestinian Authority that since 94 is busy not so much representing the Palestinians vis-a-vis the Israeli authorities as it represents the Israeli authorities vis-a-vis to the Palestinian people. So if a person comes and says, why I want a permit to go to work in Israel, the Palestinian official would tell him, you will not get a permit, don't bother, because you are ABC. Or if a woman wants to get back her residency rights in the country, in the West Bank, the Palestinian official would tell her, you cannot get it because ABC, because you were in jail or your husband was in jail or whatever. So they don't fight for the rights, but they just sometimes act, if this is a polite description, as the postman of Israeli occupation. And these officials Israel knew very well how to pamper these officials and this leadership with privileges. Very, very meager, very tiny, natural privileges. And a privilege, you know, is a mutilated right. A right is for everybody, and privilege is for the few. So it's a mutilated right. And they have been endowed with these privileges like freedom of movement that the rest of the population does not have. So of course, I mean, this is a very upsetting situation. And I would have advised sometimes I do it, but it's a bit awkward. But I believe that indeed this I've told several people in several levels that Israelis benefit from this status quo of permanent negotiations, no conclusion, and ongoing occupation and dispossession, and actually a state of apartheid and colonialism together. So Israel benefits of this, and it's up to the Palestinians to actually break the status quo or to turn the table upside down. Not because this would make a big change in Israel, but it could stir some kind of commotion or movement all over the world, maybe. In a way, the fighting back and resources and determination, a lot of it, to stand up against this bureaucracy, this very sly bureaucracy, which pretends to do something legal, but is so illegal, pretends to do something which is just personal, in this house, or that village, or that road, but it's actually a policy, needs a lot of endurance and will to live. But the resilience, which is experienced and practiced by everybody, but on a collective level, is not translated into strategized resistance. And this is the fault of the leadership, but of course. At the same time, you said that Israel was attacked twice. I think that more careful historical research is more careful about these terminologies. Of course, in 48, but it was not the Palestinians who attacked. It was the Arab states, not the Palestinians. And the Palestinians inside the country, they could not accept the Jewish attacks against them. And as the same in 67, it was not the Palestinians who attacked. But Israel had a golden opportunity with Oslo to prove that it cuts loose with its colonialist characteristics, or some of them. In 94, Israel had the golden opportunity really to go towards what everybody interpreted that Oslo wanted, but it's not written there, the two-state solution. And instead, Israel engaged in a really hysterical, rapid campaign of colonization, of annexing more land, of building more settlements, of building roads that connect each settlement to Israel and every settlement to every settlement, bypassing Palestinian communities. It started the rapid fragmentation of the West Bank, so that actually now what we are facing is a possibility to have what I call the 10-state solution. The state of Israel, and then the state of Gaza, the state of Ramallah, the state of Nablus, the state of Hebron. This is what is actually happening because of all the settlements that are encircling Palestinian Bantustans. So in a way, we could look back at 48 and then 39 and 29, etc. But I think it's very useful also to ask why in 94 Israel did not block all settlements, all construction in settlements, and really formalized an agreement that states clearly, we want two states according to international resolutions. I think this is very useful to ask, but in a way very late.
Talking about the two-state solution, which was ideal then in 1948, when it was offered to both, and do you think we would have avoided the problem we have now if, as Israel accepted, the Palestinian side would have accepted as well the state? Instead, war was waged. Do you think we would have avoided the problems that we have now if they had accepted? And now that we are in this state,
Yeah.
you can answer both if I would appreciate that. Two-state solution would be ideal, of course, but then if one side wants the other side to be driven all the way to sea, how do you find a solution?
Who is driving whom to the sea? So far, I see Israel is driving the Palestinians to the sea.
The extremists, or the Fatah, or the Hamas, they want the Israelis to be pushed to the sea. That's what we hear.
No, this was. Look, it's very difficult to deal with ifs and also with such expressions as yours when Israel dispossesses the Palestinians today. So it's very tiring to answer to the ongoing dispossessions of today. And really, I could just 1 hour, I need an hour to state all the examples of how Israelis throw Palestinians to the sea. No, I understand your question. So it's very difficult to answer how you deal with Palestinians who want to throw us to the sea. Look, it's hard for me to respond ifs about 48. And what if the Indians or the Native Americans in the 19th century would have signed or would have not signed or would have not fought where they fought against the white invasion? It's very difficult. The question is whether we are looking towards the future or always looking back to the west, to the past. Then we can ask about almost every state in the world and about this past. It is needed to discuss the past, but in order to see what we build for a future. And I think that this future has to take into account two basic things, that there are two peoples in the country, and this should not be changed. Two peoples. And then that without equality in this country, it cannot endure. An Israeli state will not endure. Nothing will endure if it is not based on the principle of equality, of respect of this principle of equality. This is also what I say about solutions. I don't know, maybe Palestinians will prefer to unite with Jordan, now that they have realized that their leadership is so incapable of really governing. Maybe once the occupation is over, they will decide something else and not to have a state. Also, in history, as we all know, there are no final solutions. Even the final solution was not complete. So every phase in history leads to another one. So the question is if this phase is benign or not, if it is based on deception and robbery and stealing, and as Israel does now, or not, or on goodwill. This is the question. Now, Hamas and Fatah, from my experience, and maybe you know more than I do, but I lived there for 14 years among these people already, I think they joke themselves about this throwing to the sea. This was used as a phrase sometime in the 50s or something like that, or in the early 60s by, or attributed to the founder of PLO. And Palestinians know very well the situations. And also many of them, as I said, brought the example, accept the existence of Israeli society. They just don't understand how Israel believes that it could persist and live as a community, normal community, when it's based only on forever on military superiority, or thinks that it can always base itself on its military superiority. And sometimes, you know, when people are so oppressed, and I think we can know it from ourselves, we Jews, we produce kind of some consolation by reiterating very extreme statements. Look what years of persecution produced with us, like the best of Goyim you should kill, or the best of, or we are the chosen people. And this was, so I wouldn't judge the Palestinians only by what you might know they say, or what was attributed to them as saying 50 years ago, 40 years ago. There is one more.
They still continue with all the it's there with every day Israelis with
Mortars. Yes.
hundreds of them every single day. So if they want peace, maybe they should stop.
You know, Pierre Bourdieu writes about masculine domination, that it has become so naturalized that it is not seen anymore. It does not need any more justifications. The same is true about occupation. The Israeli occupation has been so naturalized, especially here in this country, in America, that you don't see the occupation, you only see the reaction to it. You don't see the occupation, you don't read about the occupation, you don't read about the Israeli, I mean, the very presence. What do Israelis do in the West Bank? What do they do in Ramallah? Are they there on a trip? On a picnic? They're not on a picnic. But when when Lebanese attack north of Israel, do you think that the Israeli army in Tel Aviv will not do anything against the attack? It's the same people. They attack Ramallah, it's as if they attacked Gaza. And they are still in Gaza. When they don't allow anybody to enter or go out, it's very much occupying Gaza. It's a myth, it's a lie that we are not occupying Gaza. It's a lie. You are only reading lies in here, in this country. You only read lies. But there are many sites, websites and papers that you can read the truth. But you don't read it. It's very unfortunate, very unfortunate. So you don't see the occupation. It's as if we spoke about, I don't know, how Soviet Union was good to the workers.
I just we're about to wrap up, but I just wanted to ask you, we spoke a little last night. You heard a lot of people last night speaking about a different kind of naturalization of things going on that haven't been properly addressed with Katrina. And I wondered if you could do a little bit of comparative work with what you think is happening in these different populations trying to return to New Orleans, as you heard about last night, and what that made you think about your own work. If you could just say a little bit about that.
Oh, it's of course very different. We are talking here about citizens. But there are always similarities about oppression and discrimination. I mean, it's the details can be very different, but there is something basic that always rings a bell. So when there was talk about localism, of course localism is created in order to preserve the privileges of the whites, or of those. It's so clear. It's so. It's like when in Israel, when they are building this road or they are issuing such a law. Of course, this law is destined to preserve the privileges of the hegemonic elite, which are the Jews now in Israel. So this is very similar. Or what's similar is this continuity. Like it was really shocking to learn that when people were evacuated, they were not told where they were going, or They were separated, families were separated. So it's not, but that you can find in Israeli forms of dispossessions this continuity. I met now in Ann Arbor, I met with a Palestinian writer who is also an Israeli citizen, Anton Shamas. I met him after a long time that we hadn't seen each other. And he told me how he remembers from the 50s in his village, Fasuta, in the north of Israel, very near to the Lebanese border. He remembers the way that the Israeli authorities, it was all Israel, they were Israeli citizens, how they expropriated their land. So he said those Israelis would come. I gave later the attributes and the adjectives. But they came with huge maps to villagers who know the place from the tree and the stones and the rocks and the cacti, the family stories. And all of a sudden, those bureaucrats come with huge maps, very detailed, and they say, this is yours, this is his, now this we have to take for the good of the public, which is almost always Jewish, for a Jewish neighborhood, and this we take for a road, etc. And I could see it because that's what I see when I got in the West Bank now. And I know that those bureaucrats, new bureaucrats, now they could be their grandchildren, or immigrants from Russia also, who come and are enrolled into the army, and they bring those villagers, those maps, very detailed maps, and they say, you planted a tree outside where it's not permitted to plant a tree. Or you built this house in 97, and only until 95 could you build it, or things like that. And you see this arrogance of the ruler. You see this arrogance, and then I can think about arrogance of all rulers in the world, all privileged, hegemonic elites in the world. So this is now return. You know that there are Palestinians. Okay, we talk about 48. We know that 48 refugees cannot return, but there are so many who, in 67, either were not present when the war broke out, were not present in the country. They went to study abroad or work, or went to relatives. The West Bank was almost part of Jordan, so people went. Many people were in Amman, and then the war broke out. They could not return. Then Israel held a census in August 67. So all people who were born in the West Bank and just happened not to be there and were not present in this census lost their residency rights. And they are, till today, they are not called refugees, they are called, I forgot now. Yes, no, not absent, no, it's not, no, I forgot, sorry. But they are, according to the Oslo agreement, they should have gotten back their residency rights. And they have not. So the Israeli negotiates with the Palestinians on a quota. So every year they should get, 2,000 of them should get their residency rights back. And for 7 years this was all frozen. And then you have, and it's amazing. You see people who have family and family in a village, and they could not visit. If they are from Jordan or Egypt or Damascus or Syria, if they live now in one of these Arab countries, they cannot even visit, so they haven't seen the parents. Now you have Gazans that Israel, since 91, actually Israel does everything possible to disconnect Gaza from the West Bank. And it came to the state that now Gazan Palestinians who live in the West Bank, Israel considers them as illegal in the West Bank, even though they lived there for 25 years or 20 years, even if they have family there. They can be deported any moment to Gaza for nothing. So I know people who live actually in almost underground. They cannot go abroad. They cannot leave their own city because they will be caught by an Israeli soldier. And some of them told me, I've gotten used to the idea that my parents will die on me in Gaza and I will not see them. and you have many. And these things are you know, it's these details that are accumulated and accumulated over the years, and it just goes beyond the radar of, you know about the mortars, you don't know about this. One more question, and I think that it's...
I have two questions, rather. One relates to what you were talking about. How can we reach out and explain these very obvious facts that are just being ignored around here? Because the way I see it, the American diaspora, in specific, the Jewish American diaspora, is really trying to realize its identification with the Israeli state by providing this carte blanche, which is abused in a sense. So what means do we have to communicate these things? And the other question is regarding this new split between Gaza and the West Bank, and also those Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. Some have argued that this indicates the dismantling of the Palestinian identity itself, and that perhaps there is no more chance for a two-state, two-nation solution, because the other nation is no longer a nation in any correct sense.
Yeah. I'll start with the second question. It's true that there is a lot of animosity now between Hamas and Fatah, and between the leaderships of Hamas and Fatah, but I believe that the bonds, imagined and concrete bonds between Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are quite strong, though politically now many of them have relinquished the idea of having, in the near future, a state in Gaza and the West Bank. And Fatah has done so, and just before the Hamas takeover, military takeover of Gaza in almost a year ago in June 2007, there were many talks in Fatah about return to the so-called Jordanian solution, that Gaza somehow will be either connected to Egypt or something like that. Anyway, will not be included, and what remains of the West Bank will be incorporated with Jordan. And this was very much proposed by middle-class Palestinians who are tired of their leadership. Of course, officially they all would not sign on this. But this was a lot of talk. Now, Hamas on it, so since the takeover, both Hamas and Fatah did their best to actually play into the hands of Israel and disconnecting Gaza from the West Bank. Abu Mazen froze all work in Gaza, so they pay salaries to people on condition they don't go to work in the Palestinian ministry, governmental offices. So Hamas has to pay, so Hamas has to fill in the void. He ordered Abu Mazen, all judges and all police not to go to work, so Hamas of course had to nominate their own judiciary. At the same time, Hamas, since they got to power, and in democratic elections, as we should stress, Hamas are, it seems that it's very important for them to prove that an Islamic rule is possible by all costs. So even at the cost of separation between Gaza and the West Bank. And they played into the game of having a government. What for a government? As if there is a state, and there is no state. So the people are wary of their governments, of the two governments of the two non-states. They are wary of them, but somehow the governments are actually a pipe for salaries. It's it became, the importance of these two governments are their salaries. I don't know, look, they have the same mobile company, cellular company, and they all the time SMS jokes from each other, from Gaza to the West Bank. So maybe it's one of the signs that it's still one people, these common jokes. Now what to do here? It's also valid in Israel. We've tried the moral arguments, it didn't work. We've tried the practical ones, didn't work. I don't know if the frightening arguments will help, like to say, how can you expect always to rely on your military superiority? Sooner or later it will collapse. Look at the Soviet Union, that's what Palestinians say. Maybe something will happen in Jordan. It's nothing guaranteed that the government, that the people there will tolerate this stupid kingdom forever. Something might happen in Egypt. But this way, it's very difficult to convince the Israelis. It seems they live very much in the very near presence. And I should end maybe with one question that I heard from two Palestinians, one top official and one villager. The top official, it was the time when he still spoke to me, and he was speaking with, negotiating with the Israelis. It was Likud times, so long ago. And he was very frustrated because, of course, the negotiations led to nothing. And he asked me, after he briefed me, he said, "Tell me, Amira," but this was really like a personal question. Don't Israelis think about their grandchildren? And the same week, just by chance, the same week, a villager from a village that is often attacked by a nearby settlement, really very malicious attacks and physical, and they burn their trees and don't let them work in their fields and unleash dogs. I myself was attacked by these settlers. So this villager asked me at the end of when he tells me what happened to him, he says the same question. Don't Israelis think about their grandchildren? Maybe this is a way to tell people here that if you really care for Israel, you just should intervene so it does not continue to rely on its military superiority. Maybe. Forever.